Hello everyone, welcome to Thin ASMR. I'd like to take this moment to talk about a little discussed event in early American history. As the New World was getting colonized, Spain had well-established colonies in the Caribbean. They had also established colonies in Mexico, as well as some other places. So they were looking at the possibility of searching for more gold, more riches, and potentially doing some colonization of their own in other places. Places like South America and as well as Mexico had been very profitable for the Spaniards. In fact, one of the men who was part of the Pizarro conquest, named Hernando de Soto, because he had profited so greatly from that Pizarro conquest of the Incas, they named him governor of Cuba. And eventually De Soto was charged with an expedition to Florida, or La Florida as they called it. This wasn't an expedition of colonization, but one that was searching for gold and profit. So coming up from Cuba in May of 1539, De Soto and his army of 500 landed in Tampa Bay, or what is now modern-day Tampa Bay. And it was a native village of Ozita that they went to first. Among the Ozita village, they found Juan Ortiz. Juan Ortiz had been marooned during a previous expedition called the Narvaez expedition, which is an altogether different story. Just a little preview for you on that. I will be discussing that in a later video. And it is a fantastic story and one of the greatest stories in American history. So there's your little preview. Juan Ortiz acted as a translator for De Soto throughout the expedition. Natives immediately started causing problems for De Soto's expedition. They were ambushing the Spaniards behind trees. And so they started heading north looking for gold. And they spent that entire summer fending off native attacks and trudging through swampland. And some of the swampland that they were going through are likely modern day areas where Orlando and Disney World is now located. So as they kept heading north, a lot of the natives had heard that they were coming. They abandoned many of those villages, and which gave De Soto an opportunity to raid their crops. And essentially that helped keep De Soto's men well fed during that time. So as they're heading through these deserted villages, finally they get to a village up north called Napatuca. There was a chief there among that tribe named Vitachuco. It didn't take very long before the Spaniards were in a battle with the natives of Napatuca. They were, however, able to get the upper hand because the Spaniards had skilled horsemen. The natives were very inexperienced dealing with horses. So after killing Chief Vitachuco and then many other natives, the Spaniards allowed some of the remaining natives to keep their lives. But the Spaniards enslaved the natives and forced them to carry their provisions. So they were heading west from Napatuca towards Appalachia. De Soto had heard about Appalachia and decided that was a good place to make winter camp. So all these casualties and difficulties that were being endured by the Spaniards and the natives ensured that any future interactions that they had with the natives would not be smooth. All these tribes in these areas had heard about how heavy-handed De Soto was in dealing with the previous ones. So as they continued toward Appalachia, De Soto heard about a port over here in modern-day Pensacola area called Akusi. That port would be very easy for anyone sailing to bring provisions to be resupplied from Cuba. So De Soto then sent a captain named Maldonado back to Cuba and told him to meet in Akusi the following summer. So as De Soto and his men made winter camp in Appalachia, one of the natives dazzled the Spaniards with a story of a marvelous land near the rising sun, as they put it, which would have been northeast. So in that area, he had heard that there was a female ruler who had been paid tribute by many powerful chiefs, and there was an endless supply of gold. That's all it took for De Soto. He decided he was heading northeast towards the Promised Land once they were done with winter camp. So as De Soto and his men headed northeast, the Spaniards noted a change in both the native lifestyle and behavior. Rather than the grass-roofed huts that they had seen in Florida, they were now in what is now modern-day Georgia, and the roofs were thatched with cane. They had better dealings with natives in this area. The natives actually did supply De Soto and his men with turkey and maize, and they even agreed to guide them towards where the supposed Promised Land was. So they headed northeast, and then they crossed the Savannah River right here into what is now modern-day South Carolina. And they kept heading sort of a northeast track, and then they got to a village called Cofita-Chequi. And there in Cofita-Chequi, they found the female chief they had been promised. Female chief didn't come out with a bunch of gold or anything, however, but she did offer them grain in exchange for leaving half of her grain stock for her people. She figured, I think, that if she were able to buy the Spaniards off, they would leave her alone. She even gave De Soto what they had called a large strand of pearls. Those pearls were as thick as hazelnuts. So finally, De Soto did have some treasure that he could take back to his monarch, but they wanted more, obviously, and the natives only had copper and iron pyrite. So he thought, surely there must be some gold other places if there's no gold here. So he kept pressing the female chief for more information. She did point him towards a land on the Coosa River in Alabama that she had heard about. So De Soto decided to start heading that way. De Soto requested that the female chief provide him with a guide to get him there, but unfortunately she would not provide that for him, and her reasoning had to do with the poor behavior of the Spanish, and it can sort of be filled in the blank, sort of what that poor behavior was, likely theft and rape. So the female chief refused to send any guides with them. So then De Soto kidnapped her and then started heading the expedition north into the Blue Ridge Mountains. And as they headed up into the Blue Ridge Mountains, they started turning southwest and they got to a little village. The name of the village was Chiaha, and I'm circling it now. In Chiaha, they found an agreeable chief who fortunately was able to give them food. But that wasn't enough for DeSoto. DeSoto demanded 30 female slaves for his officers. And then the chief refused that. And then that night, the native men smuggled the women out of town. The Spaniards then captured the men and then made them serve as porters to help them carry their provisions. So continuing the journey southwest, DeSoto finally got to the Coosa River. They were near modern-day Rome, Georgia. And DeSoto repeated the same pattern of capturing the local chief. But this time, DeSoto actually released the chief as he headed out of territory. But then DeSoto had kidnapped the chief's sister and would not release her. And apparently that was saddened the chief of Coosa, who reportedly was left in tears as DeSoto and his men departed. So they headed down the southwest track, I should say, to a town called Tallahassee. So in this town, a powerful chief sent messengers to DeSoto. And DeSoto met this chief by the name of Tuscaloosa. Tuscaloosa sat on a platform on a mound in the village, which greatly impressed DeSoto. But for his part, Tuscaloosa didn't seem impressed at all by the military might of the Spaniards. He refused to speak to anyone, would only speak to DeSoto. And for his part, DeSoto seemed actually very kind to Tuscaloosa at first, but then eventually Tuscaloosa put him under guard. The Spaniards asked Tuscaloosa for slaves, and he promised 100 women if he would proceed in a southwest track towards the town of Mobila. And that town, and I'm going to circle it here, is now modern day Selma, Alabama, or it's so believed. DeSoto obliged, but kept Tuscaloosa under guard and sent some scouts ahead. The scouts had indicated to DeSoto that it appeared that the natives of Mobila were headed to get ready for battle. But since the natives had been nice to DeSoto and gifted him with bread made from chestnuts, DeSoto disregarded all those warnings of the scouts and led his men into the town of Mobila without any concern of any impending threat. So on October 18th, DeSoto and his men entered town. There was a whole lot of fanfare, a lot of dancing by the natives, and then Tuscaloosa excused himself to talk to the resident chief of Mobila. DeSoto realized this was a problem, and he demanded that Tuscaloosa return back to him. But then Tuscaloosa replied with defiance, so one of the Spaniards cut off Tuscaloosa's arm with a sword. And that was it. Thousands of natives then poured out of their houses, shooting arrows at the Spaniards. The Spaniards then retreated to the outside of the town, attempting to reorganize. DeSoto ordered his men to attack the fortress from 4 sides and began burning the town of Mobila. The natives resisted fiercely for 5 hours. One account of the battle said, "The struggle lasted so long that many Spaniards, weary and very thirsty, went to drink in a pond nearby that was tinged with native blood, and then returned to combat." So by the day's end, 2,500 natives had died. The Spaniards lost 22 men, but 200 of them also sustained injuries from arrows, and there were 80 horse casualties, which may not sound like a big deal, but given that that was the main military might of De Soto's men, that was a huge blow to De Soto. The battle also destroyed much of the Spaniards' food, and those pearls that De Soto had obtained from Cofitachequi had burned in that fire. One account after the battle indicated that the Spaniards were dressing their wounds with the fat of dead natives. So now, as they're sitting here in this burned native village, De Soto had a decision to make. He had heard that his captain Maldonado was down here in modern-day Pensacola, so he had the option of preceding his men down here, and that would have been a really easy out that De Soto had. But there was a problem. Since the pearls had burned in the battle, De Soto essentially had nothing to bring back to his monarch. In addition to that, De Soto was dealing with undercurrents of mutiny within his own company, and he knew his reputation would be harmed if he returned back to Cuba with no treasure to speak of. So instead, De Soto doubled down and had his men head north. So as they headed north, in sort of a northwest track, they ended up in Chickaza, this native village here, which Chickaza is located in modern-day Tupelo, Mississippi. So De Soto decided to set up winter camp there. De Soto was feeling very vulnerable, so he decided to attempt to buy the natives off by gifting several of the Spaniards' pigs to the natives. Unfortunately, this gift backfired for the Spaniards because the natives loved the flavor of the pork so much that every night they started poaching additional pigs. The natives were eventually caught, and then De Soto returned the pig stealers to their people with severed hands. So in March of 1541, De Soto decided to leave winter camp and head northwest. He demanded 200 natives to carry provisions for the Spaniards from the local chiefs. At first, the local chiefs appeared to comply, but that night the natives attacked the Spaniards as they slept. The Spaniards were able to counterattack, causing the natives to retreat. So then the expedition continued northwest in a very battered and bewildered state. So they got to Quees, which is located near modern-day Memphis, Tennessee. Spaniards seized 300 women from a local tribe and sort of continued his pattern of wreaking havoc on the native locals. But then they decided to keep heading sort of a northwest track, and they sighted the Mississippi River. And it is believed that De Soto was one of the first to sight the Mississippi River of any European. However, as an aside, I want to mention that it's very likely that a previous expedition might have ended up down here near the mouth of the Mississippi, near New Orleans. So that belief that he was the first one to sight the Mississippi River may be incorrect. So as they're here at the Mississippi River, they had to figure out a way to forge that river. So they built rafts from trees, and they did manage to cross the Mississippi River. However, not before natives attacked De Soto and his men from canoes. They were able to avoid them, so they didn't inflict any huge casualties on them. So they made that successful crossing and headed northwest towards a town called Kazki on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River. And in this area, the Spaniards saw some very impressive fortified native towns. And De Soto did his best to try to pursue peace with those locals. And they were actually able to stay there and regain their strength. But the quest for gold continued, so they headed west across Arkansas. And then they wintered on the Arkansas River. So while they were wintering over here in western Arkansas, their interpreter, Juan Ortiz, had died, which made communication with the local natives impossible. So they're over here in this area of western Arkansas, which is not too far from Texarkana. And the natives there in the Tula area had attacked the Spaniards, leading the Spaniards to head sort of southeast towards the Mississippi River. So they ended up in this what would be termed the tri-state area of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And there in that area, Hernando de Soto caught a fever and died on May 21st, 1542. This was a problem for De Soto's men for obvious reasons, but also De Soto had previously tried to convince all the natives that he was an immortal or a deity. So his men did their best to try to conceal his death from the natives. They wrapped his body in a blanket and sunk it into the Mississippi River. So De Soto, having died, his men needed somebody else to lead them, so one of his lieutenants, Luis Muskoka, was left to continue the expedition. They decided they would take an overland route west towards modern-day Texas. So they're taking this overland route west in sort of a southwest track. They get down here to Texas, and there's very sparse native villages with not much for the De Soto's men to raid. So Muskoka decided, we've got to get out of Texas. It's too dry here. We can't raid any native villages. So they ended up going back towards the Mississippi River, back to around the same spot where De Soto had died. So then they had a decision to make. How are we going to get to Mexico City? And they decided the Mississippi River offered them the best chance. So they built rafts. They melted down all their iron and built rafts and used the iron as nails. But they had a little problem as they got into the spring. They wanted to leave, but a lot of floods kept them from being able to make that float trip. So by July, they set off finally down the Mississippi after the floodwaters had receded in their boats to try to get to the Gulf of Mexico. And as they're heading down the Mississippi, native tribes raided them the entire trip, and another dozen Spaniards died, and many more were wounded. So finally they made it out the mouth of the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico and down to Mexico City. Thus ends the expedition of Hernando de Soto. I hope you've enjoyed this time and our discussion regarding the journey of Hernando de Soto and the Spaniards. So I wanted to go over different takeaways that we can glean from this story. The rough-handed nature of De Soto's interactions with the natives contributed to a lot more hostile relationships down the line with other Europeans. Also, European diseases such as measles, smallpox, and chickenpox caused depopulation of several areas that the expedition went to. And perhaps one of the biggest blows was that the Mississippian native culture, which were all these organized chiefdoms, those actually devolved into less organized civilization. And so what we saw is a lot of depopulation of all these areas, not only from all the battles with the Spaniards, but also with diseases. Once those diseases were introduced into America. Another thing that happened due to this is that Spain reconsidered some of their colonization efforts after this. They did not want to really focus on areas that were northeast of Mexico due to all the difficulty that De Soto had pretty much ruined the area for Florida. They did concentrate their efforts though on Mexico, the Pacific coast, and Texas, and then they continued into the modern day state of Florida area with their settlements there, such as St. Augustine. But for the most part, their efforts were not quite the same after this. So I really appreciate your attention as we have gone over this story and this journey. I hope you will like and you will subscribe to my channel. As well, I would like for you to check out some of my other videos that I have. I've got one coming up soon that will be on the Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca expedition. That should be very interesting. It actually happened earlier than this story of De Soto, but it's a very interesting story. In addition, I would like to point to my video where I went on a ramble and talked about all of my efforts to improve my health. I hope that you will pay attention to that video and reach out to me if you have any questions or any interest in pursuing similar help for yourself. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day, and thank you for your attention.